Welcome back, everyone. We are continuing our Roman series. Changed the name from Caesarean series to Roman series. Obviously, Caesar is gone. Unless he wakes back up from the dead, he's gone. We have Cicero's finest hour, the moderate Cicero. Let's see what he's got until.
10 days for Octavius to learn of his great-uncle Caesar. It took about 10 days for Octavius to learn of his great-uncle Caesar's death. In those 10 days, the world had changed. Caesar had been laid to rest in a fiery funeral. Riots had erupted on the streets of Rome, and the contents of Caesar's will had been revealed to the public.
And remember, Octavian is pretty much adopted by Caesar, gets his name, gets 75% of his wealth. He's set up.
But Octavius didn't know any of this. All he knew was that Caesar was dead.
Cicero is like 61.
Octavius was in Illyricum, overseeing preparations for Caesar's eastern campaigns. Those campaigns were probably off now, but what did that mean? The people around Octavius advised him to take up the nearby legions and avenge his great-uncle's death, but Octavius hesitated. He didn't know what the political situation was like back in Rome. If he started moving legions around, he ran the risk of being declared an enemy of the people by the Senate.
Just like Caesar was.
Octavius decided to return to Rome as a private citizen. This was perhaps risky, but he didn't see a better option. Once he properly understood the political situation, he could decide what to do next. On the road to Rome, he began receiving a flood of letters. Caesar's will had been opened. Octavius was pretty much the last person to learn that he had been named Caesar's heir, giving him the rights to most of Caesar's Scrooge McDuck-sized fortune. As an expression of this passing of the torch, Caesar posthumously adopted Octavius as his son. When he got the news, we are told that Octavius broke down and cried.
This has got to be probably one of the best feelings in the world that also coincides with grief, which is entirely hysteria. You are a private citizen just trying to get by, doing your thing. I mean, he probably has money already, but now you have generational wealth, and it's just, you don't, what do you do? It's like you're holding the world on your shoulders, but you haven't even started.
Octavius's mother wrote him a letter advising him to return to Rome immediately, but to take the side roads, hide his identity, and be on the lookout for assassins. His stepfather separately advised him to renounce his adoption.
Bruh, what you mean renounce? You're jealous. Now, it's probably about his safety, but bruh, we ain't announcing anything. 75% of the Caesarean wealth, and I get the title Caesar. Say what you guys want to say. That sounds like a great offer.
Take the money, and to retire from public life as a monstrously wealthy man.
Oh, sorry, I pause too often, so I missed that. He wants them to take the money and run. That is just not the noble thing to do, though.
With a lot of conflicting advice coming his way, Octavius came up with his own plan. He would accept the adoption. From this moment forward, he would go by the name of Gaius Julius Caesar, the same as his adoptive father. This is hella confusing, and so historians have, over the years, decided to assign this new Caesar with the name Octavianus, or Octavian for short, which is just the past tense version of the name Octavius. But it's important to remember that this is solely a convention among historians, and that, as far as his contemporaries were concerned, he was a second Caesar. When Octavian landed in Italy, he appeared in public under his new name. The crowds hailed him as his father's son. The Senate and the people were put on notice. The heir to Caesar was returning to Rome.
They're scared. They're scared. Frightened.
Back in the capital, things were moving quickly. Antony and Lepidus had already pressured many of Caesar's assassins into leaving the city, which was good for them, but now they needed to look inward. If the Caesarian faction was to survive, the Antony-Lepidus alliance had to remain strong. As a first step, Antony's daughter was engaged to marry Lepidus' son, both of whom were children. This was a good start, but it was all symbolic. What else could they do? There was the matter of the Pontifex Maximus. The position of Rome's chief priest was a lifetime appointment, previously held by Caesar. But here's the thing. Sometime within the last year or so, the Senate passed some minor piece of legislation that said that Caesar's son would succeed him as Pontifex Maximus, Octavian. This was a problem. Antony did some quick thinking and argued that since Octavian hadn't physically come to Rome and made his adoption official yet, legally speaking, Caesar had no son, at least for the next few days.
Okay.
Antony hastily called an election and made sure that his partner Lepidus took Caesar's place as Pontifex Maximus.
Okay.
The fact that it was Lepidus and not Antony offers us an insight that maybe Antony considered himself a junior partner in this alliance. The riots and the killing and the political uncertainty had everybody on edge. Violent mobs were sometimes known to target specific politicians or threaten to burn down the entire city. There were already whispers of another civil war. Shops closed, foot traffic dried up, and a vast number of Romans went into hiding. The senator Cicero observed that, quote, even the mice are leaving. Many of Cicero's political allies had already fled the city and urged him to do the same. Cicero agonized over this decision, seeking advice from many of his friends abroad. In the end, he decided to stay in Rome and put his own life at risk so that he could fight in the Senate to avert another civil war. Friendly neighborhood historian Tom Holland calls this the most courageous decision of his life. By April, Octavian arrived in Rome. The Antony-Lepidus alliance had a legitimate claim to the leadership of the Caesarian faction, but so did Octavian. They immediately began butting heads. Cicero writes that Antony started producing old decrees from Caesar that happened to back up whatever he was pushing at the moment. Cicero suspected that they were all forgeries, but he couldn't prove it. He also noticed that Antony was really dragging his feet when it came to handing over Caesar's fortune. It was Octavian's job, as Caesar's primary heir, to fulfill the terms of Caesar's will, which included the approximately 3 months' wages promised to every adult male Roman citizen. So long as Antony controlled Caesar's money, Octavian couldn't do this. So instead, he ignored Antony. He made the rounds to many of Caesar's old allies, asking for favors and taking out personal loans. He couldn't raise the total amount this way, but he raised enough to get the ball rolling. People began receiving their money. But the most important aspect of this is that he let the public know that he was putting his own credibility on the line so that he could fulfill Caesar's commitment to the people.
Very Caesarian-like.
This made him wildly popular, virtually overnight. If Antony's goal in dragging his feet was to damage Octavian's reputation, his plan backfired badly. He would eventually release Caesar's fortune, making Octavian one of the richest people on Earth. By the summer of the year 44, Roman politics had completely realigned. Antony was still technically running things as consul, but Cicero was now the leader of a vocal anti-Antonian faction in the Senate. As Antony attempted to assert his dominance, Cicero fought him tooth and nail. The big debate over the summer was over what to do with the province of Cisalpine Gaul.
What you mean? Like, who runs it? Because this is Roman territory. We're not giving it back. I'm just speaking as a Roman. I'm a Roman right now.
Next year, Antony was due to take over as the governor of Macedonia. This was a great province. It came with 6 legions attached to it, but it wasn't the best province. The best province, given Rome's recent history, was Cisalpine Gaul. It came with a couple legions, a vibrant tax base, and most importantly, it was close to Rome.
Yeah.
The threat of crossing the Rubicon was everything now. Whoever was the governor of Cisalpine Gaul had the opportunity to dominate Roman politics from a distance. But here's the thing. Decimus, one of Caesar's assassins, was going to be the governor of Cisalpine Gaul. In fact, he'd been handpicked for this job by Caesar shortly before his death. But Antony didn't care about that. He wanted Decimus gone. He wanted that province. He proposed a swap in the Senate, Macedonia for Cisalpine Gaul, but he had some conditions. First, Antony wanted to bring over the 6 legions from Macedonia and keep the 2 in Cisalpine Gaul.
Dang! That ain't gonna fly, my man.
Giving him a massive army. Second, he wanted his brother Gaius Antonius to take his place as the governor of Macedonia, leaving Decimus with just his toga in his hands. It's pretty clear what was going on here. It's exactly the kind of thing that Cicero feared. Antony wanted to be another Caesar, another civil war.
Not gonna fly. Not gonna fly. See, I like Cicero.
Cicero fought this request in the Senate, but people were exhausted, and nobody was prepared to go nuclear over a request to transfer provinces. He lost. The Senate sided with Antony.
Good.
But Decimus didn't take this lying down. He said that Caesar had personally hand-picked him as governor.
Bro, you killed Caesar. Objection.
And he seemed to remember the Senate passing a resolution saying that all of Caesar's legislation and appointments were locked in place. Was Antony interested in tearing up that agreement? Because that would open a whole can of worms. As an act of defiance, Decimus took his legions and marched on some Gallic tribes in the Alps, winning a minor victory. The legions hailed him as imperator. He wrote to Cicero, asking if there was enough support in the Senate to get him a triumph for his victory.
A triumph, bruh.
Some people just don't have an instinct for politics because there definitely wasn't. The Senate had just voted to take away his province, but Cicero told a polite lie and said he'd look into it. So the Senate under Antony had voted to take away Decimus's province. Decimus responded by saying that they didn't have that authority. Things were at a bit of a standoff. In June, all of the major anti-Antonians got together in central Italy for a big important meeting. The following people were in attendance: Cicero, Brutus, Brutus's wife Portia, Brutus's mother Servilia, Cassius, Cassius's wife Tertulla, and a conservative senator named Favonius. Decimus would have been invited, but he was obviously busy. Cassius and his wife Tertulla were running late, so the meeting got started without them. Together, they considered an offer from the Senate that would put Brutus and Cassius in charge of grain collection in the provinces of Sicily and Asia Minor. This was basically a way to give Brutus and Cassius an excuse to stay away from Rome for the next couple years. Cicero told Brutus that they should take the offer. If they were going to continue avoiding Rome, they might as well make themselves useful. He could hold things down in the Senate.
Makes sense.
Brutus was indecisive. He told Cicero that it was always his plan to return to Rome as soon as possible. Cicero responded by saying that it was not safe for Caesar's assassins to show their faces in the city. He told Brutus that his survival was paramount, since he, as the leader of the assassins, was the Republic's only defense against tyranny.
That's a stretch.
This was blatant flattery, and who knows if Cicero even meant a word of it, but it seemed to be effective on Brutus. Cassius and his wife then rolled in there like a couple of tornadoes. Cassius got right to the point. Supervising grain collection is a slap in the face. He then launched into a litany of all of their squandered opportunities since the assassination, and in particular, he criticized Decimus for not being aggressive enough in Cisalpine Gaul. Cassius informed the group that he would be turning down the grain collection job. Instead, he would be heading to the province of Syria, where he was supposed to take over as governor next year.
You gonna take on the Parthians while you're at it?
If the Senate wanted to take his province away, let him try. Brutus was like, fine. If Cassius was doing that, he would head to Asia Minor to help out another prominent conspirator, Trebonius. Brutus's mother Servilia spoke up and said that if that was their decision, she would persuade some friendly senators to get the offer rescinded. With their decision made, Cassius continued to hammer away at the absent Decimus for letting Antony get the better of him. Cicero tried to calm things down, telling everybody that it was useless to dwell on the past. He then began to, with no self-awareness, point fingers at everybody else in the room, asking each of them why they were not more decisive in the days following the Ides of March. Why on earth did they barricade themselves on the Capitoline Hill and
They were scared. They didn't plan for it. They were scared.
hand the initiative to Antony? What was the purpose of that? Servilia cut him off and shut down the debate. Nobody was really happy, but at least now they had a plan. Cicero would continue to work the Senate in Rome. Brutus would head to Asia Minor, and Cassius would head to Syria. From these powerful positions, they would have the strength to support Decimus against Antony. In the days following the meeting, Cicero privately railed against his allies for being completely useless ever since the Ides of March.
That's funny.
He wrote in one letter that, quote, "In good truth, I found a ship with timbers all gone to pieces. No plan, no system, no method."
Well, y'all didn't include Caesar on the assassination either, so there's a lot of misalignment here.
By the autumn of 44 BCE, Cicero had switched to a much more aggressive posture. He made a series of speeches and distributed a series of pamphlets that directly denounced Antony as a tyrant. These are known.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that though. I can see that a little bit. Antony's just trying to emulate Caesar at this point with the legions and then kicking them out. Yeah.
As the Philippics, and they survive to this day. Another one of Cicero's political innovations was that he began to publicly praise Octavian. If he could split the Caesarian faction between Antony and Octavian, he might be able to oust Antony in a moment of weakness. Octavian welcomed the support of Cicero and used the opportunity to ramp up his own criticism of Antony. Over this period, Cicero and Octavian got really close. Octavian began calling the older man father as a sign of respect. The opportunity to split the Caesarian faction came sooner than anybody expected. In October of 44, when Antony left Rome to inspect some legions, Octavian used his newfound wealth to raise a private army and march on Rome. It wasn't a very big army, only 3,000 retired soldiers.
6 cohorts. Are they gonna cross the Pomerium?
But it was enough to occupy the city. And just like that, a civil war had begun. It was incredibly sudden and strange. Nobody had bothered to make any official declarations or anything, it just happened.
See, Cicero's playing with fire here though.
Antony approached from the south with those legions he was inspecting. 6 in total, 30,000 soldiers if they were at full strength. By November, Octavian had abandoned Rome and fled north, and Antony had reoccupied the capital. But Octavian quickly learned that 2 of those 6 legions under Antony were unhappy to be marching against the son of Caesar. At their first opportunity, they abandoned Antony and came over to Octavian's side. Antony's first instinct was to have Octavian declared an enemy of the people, but with several of his legions defecting and Cicero leading a vocal anti-Antonian faction in the Senate, he wasn't sure if such a thing would pass. Both sides now appealed to Decimus for support. With his 2 legions, he could easily tip the balance in either direction. But there was never any doubt. Decimus sided with Octavian. Cicero ramped up his attacks in the Senate. All of the pieces were falling into place. But Antony surprised everybody. He marched north, around Octavian's legions, and headed straight for Decimus in Cisalpine Gaul. Antony's legions outnumbered Decimus's by 2 to 1, but honestly half of those under Decimus were straight up rookies, so really it was more like 4 to 1. Cicero urgently wrote to Brutus, who was currently in Greece, urging him to bring all available legions to Decimus's aid. Brutus was kind of baffled by this. Had they all lost their minds? Had they really thrown in their lot with the son of Caesar? If the Caesarian faction was fighting amongst themselves, that was good. Just sit back and wait for the dust to settle. What were they thinking? Brutus was horribly out of touch.
Well, Brutus might be also thinking of his own destiny here.
With how quickly things were changing in Rome. Whether he meant it or not, he had just stabbed Decimus in the back.
Yeah, because his intent is way different than Decimus's.
In Cisalpine Gaul, Antony demanded Decimus's surrender. Decimus refused. Within a matter of days, Cicero worked his magic in the Senate and passed two pivotal pieces of legislation. First, he got Octavian appointed pro-praetor, which meant that he had the right to command an army while still being accountable to the consuls. It legitimized his illegal actions up to this point. Second, all governors, including Decimus, were to keep their current provinces for the foreseeable future. Anybody trying to take away anybody else's province, for any reason, would be in violation of the law. Cicero and the Senate sent a stern letter to Antony, instructing him to stand down. He refused. At the beginning of the new year, Antony's term as consul expired, and two new consuls took office, former Caesarians, who were now loyal to Cicero. The two new consuls took command of 4 legions, and joined up with Octavian in central Italy.
Antony's about to get crushed here, guys, unless something crazy happens.
Together, they all marched north to Decimus's aid. Cicero instructed one of the consuls to assume overall command, and the other to split off and raise additional legions. The consuls followed Cicero's orders, which tells you a lot. Decimus didn't mess around, and quickly moved to occupy the city of Mutina. He mobilized the entire population in preparation for a siege, and before too long, he had several years of food in storage, and was training a new legion made up of locals. This was a smart, strategic move. Antony was way out on a limb, and Decimus had Cicero and the Senate on his side. All he had to do was drag things out until friendly legions arrived. Antony must have finally realized that he was in a sticky situation, because his next move was to send a peace offer to Cicero.
And I mean, some of his people might defect at the same time.
He would withdraw from Cisalpine Gaul, he said, if the Senate would agree to grant him the province of Transalpine Gaul, which was all the territory north of here, basically all of Caesar's conquests from the Gallic Wars. Obviously, Cicero said no. The 1-year anniversary of Caesar's assassination came and went with very little fanfare. In April, Octavian and one of the consuls arrived in Cisalpine Gaul. They outnumbered Antony 7 legions to 4, but since many of their legions were new and inexperienced, and Antony's were not, they judged that the two sides were basically equally matched. They decided to wait for the other consul to show up with 4 additional legions. But Antony surprised everybody for a second time. He abandoned the siege of Mutina and marched south, back around Octavian and the one consul, and set up between the two armies. Antony set an ambush and tricked the consul to the south into attacking through some wetlands.
Oh no.
The fighting was exhausting, but by the end of the day, Antony's legions had stormed the enemy camp. The consul was killed in the fighting.
What? Okay, now Antony is now an enemy of the state of Rome. So now it's war on Antony. I guarantee you.
Octavian and the other consul sent help, but they arrived too late. There was another minor clash, but Antony and his exhausted legions withdrew back to the north. Octavian and the only remaining consul decided not to delay any longer. They marched to relieve the siege of Mutina. Antony's exhausted legions put up a fight, but when Decimus opened the city gates and attacked from the other direction, he was forced to retreat. This battle happened on Decimus's birthday, which is not important, but it is funny.
Happy birthday. Happy birthday.
Speaking of our collective unceasing march toward death, that other consul died during the battle. That means that both Roman consuls had died in battle, something that had not happened in 2 centuries, not since the Punic Wars.
Wow.
With news of the victory, Cicero had the Senate name Antony an enemy of the people.
Knew it was happening.
Can we just pause for a moment to appreciate what Cicero had accomplished here? A year ago, it looked like Antony was about to become a second Caesar. Instead, Cicero implemented a political strategy that split the Caesarian faction.
And he pretty much groomed Octavian to be what he is now.
And ended with Antony being declared an enemy of the Republic. What an achievement! Antony retreated north across the Alps and joined up with Lepidus. Decimus followed close behind. Meanwhile, Brutus was in Greece. Through diplomacy, he had used this time to gather the support of all of the provincial governors from Illyricum to Syria. This was all highly illegal, of course, but Cicero eventually secured for him an actual command, which gave the whole thing some legitimacy. Through this process, Brutus captured Antony's brother, Gaius Antonius. Cassius was still in Syria, in command of 8 legions. Some clever thinking allowed him to intercept a Roman army headed from Egypt to Italy, bringing his total up to 12 legions. Cassius pressed Brutus to go on the attack, but Brutus remained cautious. He argued that since they had broad support across the empire, there was no need to force one decisive battle. Much better to just let the Caesarians bleed each other dry. I do my best to be generous to these historical figures who were acting with imperfect information, but I will point out that during this crisis, Brutus's first instinct always seemed to be do nothing. That's an alarming trait. I wonder how different things would have been if Cassius had been the one put in charge. By the summer of 43, Octavian began to complain to Cicero about the empty consulships. He said that it was impossible to prosecute a war without leadership at the top. He said that, wait for it, he should be named a replacement consul. It's not actually clear that this was necessary at all. Elections were already ramping up for next year, the Senate was functioning properly, the armies in the field were winning. What was the big emergency? Cicero and the Senate denied Octavian's request. And then, just like that, Octavian marched on Rome.
Cicero's been playing with fire, guys, I told you.
Again. Things are getting pretty wacky, so let's take a second to recap. Decimus was attacking Antony. Cicero and the Senate were supporting Decimus and attacking Antony. Brutus and Cassius were supposed to be attacking Antony, but since they distrusted Octavian, they were keeping their powder dry. Octavian had been attacking Antony, but now he was attacking Cicero and the Senate. It was starting to look like a 5-sided civil war. Cicero and the Senate called upon 4 legions in North Africa to defend the capital, but all 4 went over to the son of Caesar.
Oh my.
Octavian sent some centurions into the city of Rome to negotiate. According to one account, maybe embellishing a bit for dramatic effect, the lead centurion approached a group of senators, rested his hand on the hilt of his sword, and said, "If the Senate does not make Octavian a consul, this will."
It's gonna happen.
The Senate called special elections, but everybody knew the results in advance. Octavian and one of his cousins were elected consuls.
How old is Octavian at this point?
And took office immediately. One of Octavian's first acts was to condemn Caesar's assassins, officially ending the grand compromise that was set up immediately after Caesar's assassination.
That's Brutus, that's Cassius, that's Decimus, that's others as well.
If you remember, the assassins were granted amnesty in exchange for ratification of Caesar's political acts. That was all over now. Octavian had altered the deal. Cicero was distraught. He bitterly wrote to Decimus, telling him that, quote, "The Senate was my weapon, and it has fallen to pieces in my hand."
But remember, guys, this video is called Cicero's Finest Hour. There is still 8 minutes left on this video, so I can't make an assumption what's going to happen. Nevertheless, up to this point, Cicero has been playing with fire, and he is getting burnt.
He also wrote to Brutus in Greece, telling him to get to Rome as soon as humanly possible. Incredibly, Brutus refused. He seemed to believe that he and Cicero were having some minor disagreement over tactics. He was mistaken. What Cicero was actually saying was that he had lost the war. His attempt to split the Caesarian faction had failed.
Now what?
In defeat, Cicero left the city in Octavian's hands and retired to the Italian countryside. As consul, Octavian opened up negotiations with Antony. In doing so, he stabbed Cicero, Decimus, Cassius, Brutus, and the entire Roman Senate in the back.
Well, Decimus, Cassius, and Brutus literally stabbed his father in the back.
Antony and Lepidus spent all summer recruiting soldiers, and by the autumn, they re-entered Cisalpine Gaul with 18 legions.
18? 18? If these are full, that's 18 times 5. That's nearly 90,000 troops.
Decimus had no choice but to pull back. On his difficult trek back through the Alps, most of his army deserted him. His initial plan was to head east and join forces with Brutus and Cassius, but without an army there was very little point in doing that. Instead, he decided to head north. Decimus had spent the better part of a decade campaigning with Caesar in Gaul. He had plenty of allies up there, he was fluent in the language, perhaps he could pull some strings and raise an army. But apparently when Decimus reached the Rhine River, everybody, including his bodyguards, abandoned him. Without protection, it wasn't safe for Decimus to be in Gaul, and so he changed plans once more, disguised himself as a local, and started making his way east to Brutus. But Decimus's string of bad luck would not end. While going through a totally routine checkpoint in Cisalpine Gaul, a Roman soldier recognized his face. Decimus was captured, and Antony demanded his head. Within a few days, he got it.
Well, dang. That's one main conspirator down. There's 2 to go.
Late in the year, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus met near the border of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy to negotiate a deal. This deal would become known to historians as the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the First Triumvirate between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this was official, backed up with the full force of law. All 3 triumvirs would be awarded dictatorial power for 5 years. In addition to this, each would be responsible for governing a portion of the western half of Rome's empire. Remember, Brutus and Cassius still controlled the east. Antony would control Gaul, which is exactly what he had wanted since the beginning. Lepidus would control Spain. Octavian would control North Africa and the Mediterranean islands like Sicily and Sardinia. You can tell from this agreement that Octavian was the junior partner here. The triumvirate also gave the 3 the ability to make law without consulting the Senate or the people of Rome. This is, frankly, what Cicero had feared all along. Unchecked authoritarian power. A Roman monarchy with 3 heads. Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian then ordered a purge of Rome's political class. The Romans called these proscriptions. This was not without precedent. The dictator Sulla had ordered large proscriptions 40 years earlier, but this was regarded as a traumatic event, not only to Rome's political class, but to Caesar personally, who was careful to avoid doing the same thing when he came to power. But Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian were young, and had no memory of Sulla's purge. They didn't care. Their enemies had to go. The way proscriptions worked is that every day a list would be posted in a public place with the names of those that had been proscribed. Anybody on the list was instantly stripped of their citizenship and was no longer under the protection of Roman law. Any citizen who ratted out or murdered a proscribed person was entitled to seize a portion of their wealth, with the rest going to the state.
This is horrible.
The proscriptions were truly a repugnant practice. They turned a whole generation of murderers into millionaires. Of course, many fled as soon as their names appeared on the proscription lists, but the promise of wealth completely destroyed friendships and tore families apart. It was horrible. As much as a third of the Roman Senate was proscribed, as well as thousands of other rich citizens. In fact, the historian Appian writes that some were proscribed simply because they were rich. That's bad, I think. No,
bad.
That's bad. Murder's bad. We're anti-murder in this house. There was an ongoing negotiation between...
I could see for just a second he has a bias against rich people, which is, he's anti-capitalist immediately, I know that.
Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian as to who would appear on the proscription lists. In the end, they were all forced to compromise and give up people who they would have preferred to save. Antony gave up his uncle. Lepidus gave up his brother. Octavian gave up Cicero, the man that he had once called father. Antony was the one who insisted.
Cicero's finest hour.
On December 7th, 43 BCE, a small group, led by a military tribune and a centurion, showed up at Cicero's villa. The doors were locked, but they busted in. After interrogating some workers, they learned that Cicero was on his way to the sea. They caught up with him on the road. He knew that he was caught. He told his entourage to stop. They found him in a reclined position, reading. He spoke to his killers. "I am stopping here." He turned to the lead centurion. "Come here, soldier. There's nothing proper about what you're doing, but at least make sure you cut off my head properly." Cicero stuck out his neck and indicated what he wanted done. The centurion slit his throat. The group of killers then cut the head and the hands off of Cicero's body and sent them to Antony as proof. Antony nailed Cicero's hands to the speaking platform outside the Senate House.
This is barbaric.
Same hands that wrote all those pamphlets opposing him 1 year ago.
Wow.
It is so upsetting that Cicero went out this way. He deserved better.
Yeah.
Historian Anthony Everett calls him the greatest statesman in Roman history.
Wow.
I love Cicero. I'm in that camp too.
He did, unfortunately, create a monster, though, so far.
Years later, when Octavian was an old man, he caught his grandson reading something that Cicero had written. His grandson had some vague notion that this was some old enemy of his grandfather's, and so in a panic, he tried to hide the writing under his clothes. Octavian saw what he was trying to do, and had him hand it over. For a long time, he stood there, reading the words of Cicero, written in another era. In time, he handed the writing back to his grandson, saying, "My child, this was a learned man, and a lover of his country."
Wow. Actually, we'll just stop right here. So, Cicero's finest hour. Now, it makes sense that this is titled that now. Overall, like, the track record of Cicero cannot be tarnished by one unfortunate series of events. This was a crazy episode. Cicero and the faction of Brutus and Cassius, etc., really tried to make their mark. Cicero's caught in the middle. He's a moderate. He's been caught in the middle this entire time. Then Antony and Lepidus are trying to do their own thing. And then Octavian is just the wild card. Octavian wasn't supposed to exist here. Octavian was the wild card, the outsider. Now he's an insider. Now he's consul. He did exactly what Caesar did. Became a friend of the people. Became a friend of the legions, of the soldiers. When you have the soldiers and the people on your side, you are unstoppable. Then he definitely wasn't going to choose the side of Brutus and Cassius. They murdered his predecessor. So what does he do? Chooses Antony and Lepidus. They become the second triumvirate. They control most of the territory. The only territory they don't control is like the eastern side. The eastern side is flanked by Dacians and Parthians. They are in the driver's seat here. However, Octavian is definitely the junior. You can see that if it was up to him, Cicero might still be alive. For Cicero, like I said, groomed him to be in this spot. He brought him in. He showed him the ways. Of course, Octavian took to his own and went out there, but it's clear that Octavian did not want Cicero dead. He agreed to it, but almost in compromise, not in will. So, very interesting stuff here. I'm assuming next we're going to see the Second Civil War. No, when I say Second Civil War, I mean of what we've watched. if it's even called that. But the factions of the Second Triumvirate versus the eastern side of the Roman Empire probably will commence soon. Brutus and Cassius has a lot of army. They have really good territory. They have a hold on pretty much the entire eastern side. Very curious to see what happens next. Thank you guys so much for reacting. Not reacting. I did the reacting. Thank you guys so much for watching What's the More. I appreciate you guys so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Peace out. See you next time.